Welcome back to the Old West Tales, where every story whispers secrets of love, heartbreak, and redemption. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. Drop your location in the comments. I'm curious which part of the world my viewers are from. Sit back and let me take you on a journey that might just melt your heart tonight. Red dust drifted across the rolling hills outside Blackstone Valley as a line of riders slowly climbed toward the family cemetery overlooking thousands of acres of grazing land. The mournful sound of a church bell echoed across the prairie, while nearly every rancher in the county removed his hat in respect. At the front of the procession rode 23-year-old Abigail Blackstone, the daughter of the richest ranch owner in western Texas. Her blue eyes were swollen from days of crying, yet grief had already begun turning into something colder. Beside her rested the pine coffin carrying her older brother, Daniel Blackstone, the man everyone believed would one day inherit the famous Blackstone Ranch. Daniel had been fearless, honest, and loved throughout the territory. 2 days earlier, he had ridden out to inspect missing cattle and never returned alive. His body had been found beside the Brazos River with a single bullet through his chest. There had been only one witness. A ranch hand claimed he saw poor Cowboy Luke Carter galloping away from the river moments after the gunshot. Luke disappeared before anyone could question him. By sunrise, every newspaper within 100 miles branded him a murderer. Abigail believed every word. As Daniel's coffin was lowered into the earth, Henry Blackstone stood beside his daughter with his weathered face hardened by sorrow. He placed one hand on her shoulder while the preacher finished the final prayer. When the crowd began leaving, Abigail remained staring at the fresh grave. The wind lifted strands of her dark hair as tears rolled silently down her cheeks. She bent down, pressed one trembling hand against the dirt, and whispered, "I promise you, Daniel, the man who did this will never know peace." Henry looked toward the distant horizon, where endless grasslands disappeared beneath the afternoon sun. "Revenge won't bring your brother back," he said quietly. Abigail rose to her feet, her expression no longer filled with sadness but determination. "Maybe not, but Luke Carter will answer for what he did." Henry said nothing. Deep inside, something about the entire story troubled him. Daniel had often spoken well of Luke, calling him one of the hardest-working cowboys he'd ever known. It never made sense that Luke would suddenly murder him over a few missing cattle. But with no evidence pointing elsewhere and Luke nowhere to be found, even Henry found himself accepting the explanation. Miles away, hidden inside a narrow canyon, Luke Carter watched smoke from the funeral drifting across the valley. His horse stood quietly beside him while guilt and frustration battled across his face. He had not killed Daniel Blackstone. In fact, Daniel had died trying to protect him. Luke replayed those terrible moments every night. Daniel had sent him a note asking to meet beside the river because he had uncovered something dangerous involving stolen cattle and forged ownership papers. Before Daniel could explain everything, a rifle cracked from the hills. Daniel collapsed instantly. Luke chased the unseen shooter, but masked riders emerged from the trees and opened fire. Realizing he had been trapped, Luke escaped with only his life. He wanted to tell the truth, but every road leading back toward town was filled with men hunting him. Someone powerful had framed him, and that same someone intended to make sure he never spoke again. For 5 long years, Luke wandered across the western territories, working cattle drives, breaking horses, repairing fences, and sleeping beneath open skies. He avoided large towns, never stayed anywhere long enough for questions, and learned to live with the reputation of a murderer. Meanwhile, Abigail transformed Blackstone Ranch into one of the finest operations in Texas after her father's help began failing. She became known as a sharp businesswoman who could out-negotiate seasoned cattle barons and outride nearly every cowboy she hired. Wealthy ranch owners traveled from neighboring states hoping to court her, but Abigail refused every offer. Her heart belonged only to the memory of her brother, and hatred for Luke Carter remained as fierce as the day Daniel died. One autumn evening, Henry Blackstone collapsed while inspecting fences near the northern pasture. By the time Abigail reached him, he could barely breathe. She knelt beside him, holding his hand as the ranch doctor shook his head. Henry managed a faint smile. "Take care of this ranch." Abigail nodded through tears. Then Henry gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "And don't let hatred decide your future." Those were the final words he ever spoke. His funeral brought together hundreds of ranchers from across Texas. After everyone left, Abigail wandered alone to her father's office, overwhelmed by grief and responsibility. Every shelf overflowed with ledgers, contracts, land deeds, and dusty journals accumulated over decades. She intended only to organize the paperwork, but hidden behind an old bookshelf she discovered a small iron lockbox she had never seen before. Inside the box lay several personal letters, Daniel's leather-bound journal, and a folded map marked with strange symbols. Abigail carefully opened the journal. Most pages described ranch work, horse breeding, and everyday life, but the final entries made her heart pound. Daniel wrote that someone had been stealing cattle from multiple ranches across 3 counties while replacing legitimate ownership brands with expertly forged ones. He suspected a criminal organization much larger than ordinary rustlers. Then she reached the final completed page. Her breathing stopped. Written clearly across the bottom were the words, "Luke Carter is innocent. He's the only man I trust to help expose them." Abigail stared at the sentence in disbelief. She read it again, then again. It changed everything she believed. Her hands trembled as another folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages. It contained only a few hurried lines. "If anything happens to me, don't trust Sheriff Collins. Someone inside town is working with the men behind the cattle thefts. Meet Luke beside the Brazos River." Abigail's entire world seemed to tilt. If Daniel trusted Luke, why had Luke disappeared? Why had the sheriff declared him guilty before conducting a proper investigation? Had everyone been deceived? Unable to sleep, Abigail rode into town before sunrise and found retired Sheriff Walter Collins living alone in a rundown cabin outside town. Age had stolen much of the man's confidence. He reluctantly invited her inside. After she showed him Daniel's journal, the old sheriff buried his face in his hands. "I've carried this shame long enough," he admitted. "Truth is, I never saw Luke fire that gun. Neither did anyone else. One ranch hand claimed he spotted Luke riding away after hearing a shot. That's all we had. Before I could investigate further, Victor Graves convinced everyone Luke had fled because he was guilty." Abigail frowned. Victor Graves was one of the wealthiest cattle brokers in Texas and had long done business with the Blackstone family. Why would Graves interfere? Collins looked toward the window nervously. Because he always wanted the investigation closed quickly. Before Abigail could ask another question, Collins leaned closer and whispered there were things happening back then that powerful people didn't want uncovered. That afternoon, Abigail followed rumors leading north to a remote ranch where a mysterious cowboy had been working under another name. She arrived just as the sun dipped behind distant hills. A lone man repaired broken fencing, while a chestnut horse grazed nearby. Though older, leaner, and wearing a beard, Abigail recognized him immediately. Luke Carter slowly turned, his expression shifting from surprise to quiet resignation. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Luke set down his hammer. "If you're here for revenge," he said calmly, "I won't run anymore." Abigail climbed from her horse. "I found Daniel's journal." Luke's eyes widened. "He said you were innocent." Silence settled between them. After 5 years of hatred, Abigail found herself unable to speak another word. The man standing before her looked nothing like the monster she had imagined. He simply looked tired. Luke finally broke the silence. "Daniel died trying to stop men far more dangerous than me." Abigail searched his face for deception, but found only sadness. "Then tell me what happened." Luke took a slow breath and began explaining the meeting beside the river, the hidden sniper, and the masked riders who chased him after Daniel fell. Before he could finish, a rifle cracked across the valley. The bullet slammed into the fence post inches from Abigail's shoulder. Luke tackled her to the ground as another shot shattered a wagon wheel behind them. From the ridge above, 6 masked horsemen emerged with rifles leveled toward the ranch. "Ride!" Luke shouted. The riders thundered downhill, firing relentlessly. Luke pulled Abigail onto his horse, while bullets tore through the corral fences. Dust exploded around them as they raced across open pasture toward the hills. One masked rider nearly caught them before Luke swung from the saddle and knocked the attacker from his horse with a powerful kick. They barely escaped into a maze of rocky canyons where pursuers eventually disappeared. As darkness settled over the wilderness, Luke and Abigail took shelter inside an abandoned line shack. Both struggled to catch their breath, while rain began pounding the old wooden roof. Abigail looked at Luke with frightened eyes. Those men weren't trying to capture us. Luke quietly reloaded his revolver. No, he replied. They were making sure we never talked. Outside, hidden beneath the pouring rain, a lone rider wearing a black coat watched the cabin from a distant ridge. Unlike the others, he wore no mask. The only thing visible beneath the brim of his hat was a single black raven feather tucked into the band. He studied the cabin for several moments before turning his horse and disappearing into the darkness, already knowing exactly where Luke Carter and Abigail Blackstone would go next. Morning sunlight broke through the storm clouds, casting long golden beams across the rocky canyon, where Luke Carter and Abigail Blackstone had taken shelter. Neither had slept more than an hour. Every creak of the old cabin made them reach for their revolvers, expecting the mysterious riders to return. Luke stepped outside just after sunrise and carefully studied the muddy ground. The hoof prints from the previous night stopped nearly 200 yards away. Whoever had followed them knew exactly where they were hiding, but had chosen not to attack again. That troubled Luke more than another gunfight would have. It meant someone wanted them frightened, constantly moving, never giving him time to uncover the truth. When Abigail joined him outside carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, she noticed a tension on his face. "What is it?" she asked. Luke pointed toward the distant tracks. "They found us once. They'll find us again. Somebody knows every move we make." Abigail looked across the empty hills. For the first time in years, her hatred had been replaced by something else. She no longer feared Luke. She feared the invisible enemy, hunting them both. Luke told Abigail about the coded map Daniel had shown him shortly before his death. According to Daniel, several abandoned canyons had once served as secret gathering places for stolen cattle before they were driven across state lines under forged brands. The symbols inside Daniel's lockbox matched landmarks only experienced trail riders would recognize. If the map was accurate, one location lay less than a day's ride away. They agreed to investigate before returning to Blackstone Ranch. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow valley hidden behind towering cliffs. At first it appeared deserted, but Luke spotted fresh horseshoe prints leading through thick mesquite. Climbing a rocky overlook, they froze in disbelief. Below them stretched hundreds of cattle, carrying brand from dozens of different ranches. Armed guards moved among the herds, while wagons loaded with forged ownership documents waited beside a large storage barn. Abigail immediately recognized several animals stolen from neighboring ranches over the past 5 years. Daniel had been telling the truth. A massive cattle theft operation had existed all along. Luke wanted to retreat quietly with what they had seen, but Abigail noticed something inside the barn. Through a cracked window, she could see rows of ledgers stacked on wooden shelves. "Those books are the proof," she whispered. "Without them, nobody will believe us." Against Luke's better judgment, they slipped toward the building while the guards were distracted moving cattle. Inside, they discovered dozens of detailed records listing stolen herds, false ownership transfers, bribery payments, and coded shipments. Every page carried the same small black raven stamped into the corner. Luke quickly filled a saddlebag with the most important ledgers. As they prepared to leave, footsteps echoed outside. One guard entered unexpectedly. His eyes widened in shock before he reached for his rifle. Luke tackled him before he could fire, but the struggle knocked over a lantern that shattered against the floor. Flames spread rapidly through loose hay. Within seconds, the entire barn filled with smoke. The fire brought every guard running. Gunshots erupted across the canyon as Luke and Abigail burst from the burning building. Frightened cattle stampeded to the camp, scattering men and wagons in every direction. Luke and Abigail raced toward their horses under heavy fire. One bullet ripped through Luke's shoulder, but he ignored the pain and helped Abigail into the saddle. Together they escaped into the hills while black smoke rose high above the canyon. Behind them, angry voices shouted orders, but none of the pursuers dared follow far. Whoever commanded the operation clearly wanted the stolen ledgers recovered more than revenge. By sunset, they reached an isolated creek, where Luke finally allowed Abigail to examine his wounded shoulder. The bullet had passed cleanly through the flesh. She carefully cleaned the wound with whiskey before wrapping it with strips torn from her own sleeve. Luke watched her quietly. 5 years ago, he said with a faint smile, you probably would have finished the job instead. Abigail looked down, ashamed. 5 years ago, I would have believed any lie if it promised revenge. Their eyes met for a long moment before she gently tied the bandage. Neither spoke again, but something between them had changed. Trust was replacing suspicion one quiet moment at a time. The next morning they rode to Blackstone Ranch under cover of darkness. Abigail knew of a hidden cellar beneath the old smokehouse where her father kept emergency supplies. They spent hours studying the stolen ledgers. Many names were written in code, but several stood out clearly. Wealthy cattle broker Victor Graves appeared repeatedly beside enormous payments. Sheriff Collins' signature appeared on dozens of transportation permits approved without inspection. Even more shocking were entries signed simply BH. Luke frowned. Daniel mentioned initials like these before he died. Abigail searched old family correspondence until she found contracts signed by Judge Benjamin Holloway. The handwriting matched perfectly. Neither wanted to believe that the county's most respected judge could be involved. Yet the evidence grew stronger with every page. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch. It was Thomas Reed, Daniel's closest childhood friend, and now the local newspaper editor. Abigail trusted him completely. After hearing their story, Thomas agreed to secretly print everything once they gathered enough proof to survive in court. Before leaving, he warned them that Victor Graves had spent the last several days asking anyone who had seen Abigail. He's nervous, Thomas said. Rich men don't panic unless they're afraid of losing something. As Thomas rode away into the night, none of them noticed a shadow watching from the windmill outside the ranch. Just before midnight, barking dogs shattered the silence. Luke rushed outside as flames suddenly erupted along the eastern barns. Cowboys scrambled from bunkhouses, while horses screamed inside burning stables. Masked riders stormed to the front gate, firing rifles into the air. Luke immediately realized it was only a distraction. While everyone fought the fire, someone else was searching the ranch house. He sprinted inside and found Abigail struggling against a masked man dressed entirely in black. The stranger had already located Daniel's journal and was reaching for the stolen ledgers. Luke tackled him through a window. Both men crashed onto the porch below. The attacker fought with incredible skill before throwing Luke aside and escaping on horseback. As he rode away, moonlight revealed the same black raven feather tucked beneath his hat. The ranch survived the attack, but Daniel's journal had been stolen. Luke cursed under his breath. He knows exactly what we're looking for. Abigail looked toward the burning barns. No, he knows exactly what Daniel left behind. Luke suddenly remembered something Daniel once mentioned during their final meeting. Daniel believed there were two journals. One described the investigation. The other contained the names of everyone involved. If the outlaw had stolen only one, the second might still exist somewhere. The following day, Luke suggested searching Daniel's favorite fishing cabin beside the Brazos River, the place where he often disappeared for days whenever he wanted privacy. Hidden beneath a loose stone in the fireplace, they discovered a small metal box untouched by time. Inside rested Daniel's pocket watch, several personal letters, and a sealed envelope labeled, "If I don't come back." Abigail carefully opened it. Daniel wrote that if anyone found the letter, they should trust only Captain Samuel Briggs, a retired Army officer living outside Fort Worth. Daniel explained that Briggs had once investigated military supply thefts and possessed experience exposing organized criminal networks. Most importantly, Daniel wrote one final sentence that chilled them both. The Raven isn't the leader. He's the messenger. Neither Luke nor Abigail understood what that meant, but they realized a man wearing the raven feather might only be carrying out orders for someone even more powerful. They immediately rode toward Captain Briggs' ranch, arriving 2 days later. The retired officer carefully studied every ledger they had recovered. His expression grew darker with every page. Finally, he spread a large map across the table. "This isn't ordinary cattle rustling," Briggs said quietly. This is an organized empire stretching across 3 states. Judges approve fake deeds. Sheriffs protect shipments. Bankers launder profits. Ranchers report stolen cattle while secretly selling them themselves. Abigail felt sick. How many people are involved? Briggs looked at her grimly. Enough that if you accuse them without undeniable proof, you'll disappear before sunrise. Briggs agreed to help, but insisted they needed one final piece of evidence. According to the ledgers, every month the organization's leaders met inside an abandoned silver mine, known as Devil's Hollow. If they could identify everyone attending that meeting, the conspiracy would collapse forever. 3 nights later, Luke, Abigail, Briggs, and 2 trusted former Army scouts hid among the rocks overlooking Devil's Hollow. One by one, expensive carriages and horseback riders arrived beneath the moonlight. Wealthy ranchers, businessmen, politicians, even respected town officials disappeared inside the abandoned mine. Abigail recognized faces she had known her entire life. Victor Graves entered carrying a leather case filled with documents. Minutes later, another rider appeared wearing the familiar black coat and raven feather. Instead of entering first, he respectfully removed his hat as someone stepped from a luxurious carriage waiting in the shadows. The mysterious passenger never showed his face. Every criminal present bowed their heads, as though greeting the true leader. Luke whispered, "We've been chasing the wrong man." At that exact moment, a twig snapped beneath one of Briggs' scouts. Every head inside the valley turned toward the hillside. The man wearing the raven feather slowly smiled beneath his mask. "They're here," he said. Within seconds, dozens of rifles were aimed directly at Luke, Abigail, and their companions. Luke reacted before anyone else. "Run!" he shouted as rifle fire exploded across the hillside. Bullets ripped through the rocks while Captain Samuel Briggs returned fire, giving Luke and Abigail enough time to dive behind a line of boulders. The 2 former Army scouts split in opposite directions, forcing the gunmen to scatter instead of concentrating their attack. Dust filled the night air as horses screamed below. Briggs fired one last shot, striking a lantern near the mine entrance. It burst into flames, creating enough confusion for the group to escape into the darkness. They rode hard through narrow canyons until sunrise, finally stopping beside an abandoned stagecoach station. Everyone had survived, but they now understood the terrible truth. The conspiracy reached the highest levels of Blackstone County, and the mysterious outlaw known as the Raven answered to someone even more powerful. Captain Briggs spread the stolen ledgers across an old table inside the abandoned station. "We can't beat them with bullets," he said. "We beat them by making the truth impossible to hide." Luke studied the pages carefully until one detail caught his attention. Every payment, shipment, and secret meeting required legal approval signed with the initials B.H. Abigail, remembered matching those initials to Judge Benjamin Holloway's handwriting. Briggs quietly nodded. "There's only one judge with those initials in this county." Abigail refused to believe it at first. Judge Holloway had attended every Blackstone family gathering since she was a little girl. He accompanied her at Daniel's funeral and promised justice. Yet the evidence continued pointing toward him. Luke remembered something else from the night at Devil's Hollow. Every criminal removed their hats before the unseen passenger stepped from the carriage. The Raven himself had bowed his head. Only a man with enormous power and respect could command that kind of loyalty. Rather than accuse Holloway immediately, Briggs proposed setting a trap. 3 days later, Blackstone County would host its annual cattle auction, bringing together ranchers, bankers, judges, politicians, and businessmen from across Texas. If they publicly announced that Daniel's missing evidence had finally been recovered, the real mastermind would be forced to act. Briggs secretly contacted a trusted United States Marshal from another district, knowing the local law could no longer be trusted. The marshal agreed to arrive with federal deputies, but insisted they needed undeniable proof before making arrests. Luke smiled slightly. "Then we'll make them confess." Word spread quickly that Abigail Blackstone intended to make an important announcement during the auction. Victor Graves appeared unusually nervous, while Judge Holloway maintained his calm smile, greeting everyone as though nothing were wrong. The crowded town square buzzed with excitement as hundreds gathered around the auction platform. Abigail stepped onto the stage, carrying Daniel's journal in one hand and a leather satchel in the other. Unknown to the crowd, the satchel contained only blank papers. The real ledgers remained safely hidden with Briggs. Luke stood among the cattle drovers pretending to be an ordinary ranch hand, while federal deputies waited disguised as traders throughout the town. Abigail raised her voice so everyone could hear. 5 years ago, my brother Daniel Blackstone was murdered because he uncovered the largest cattle theft operation in Texas. The man blamed for his death was innocent. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Victor Graves slowly backed away. Judge Holloway remained perfectly still. Abigail continued. Daniel left behind evidence naming every person responsible. Today, that evidence will be delivered to federal authorities. Before she could finish, smoke bombs exploded across the square. Panic horses reared while frightened cattle burst through wooden pens. Masked riders stormed into town firing rifles into the air. Townspeople scattered in every direction. Luke immediately spotted the Raven leading the attack. The Outlaw rode straight toward the auction platform, determined to seize Abigail before she could escape. Luke leaped onto a loose horse and charged through the chaos. Their horses collided violently in the middle of the street, throwing both men to the ground. The Raven drew a revolver, but Luke kicked it away before the two exchanged brutal punches in the dirt. The Outlaw finally broke free and sprinted toward the courthouse. Luke chased him inside. The enormous courtroom stood empty except for sunlight pouring through tall windows. The Raven slowly closed the doors behind him and removed his black bandana. Luke stared into the familiar face beneath it. It was Thomas Reed, Daniel's closest friend, the newspaper editor, the very man Abigail had trusted with everything. Thomas smiled sadly. You look disappointed. Luke shook his head in disbelief. Daniel trusted you. He trusted the wrong people, Thomas replied calmly. I wasn't the Raven when we were young. I became him after discovering how much money powerful men would pay to keep their secrets. Luke frowned. You're still taking orders. Thomas laughed softly. Of course I am. The courtroom doors opened behind him. Judge Benjamin Holloway entered slowly, removing his gloves with complete confidence. I believe this conversation concerns me, he said. Luke suddenly understood. Thomas had never been the leader. He had only been the messenger. Judge Holloway smiled warmly, almost like a grandfather greeting an old friend. For 20 years, I built an empire. Ranchers needed money. Bankers needed profits. Politicians needed votes. I simply connected them. Daniel became curious. Curiosity got him killed. Luke clenched his fists. You murdered him. No, Holloway answered calmly. Thomas fired the shot. I merely gave the order. Thomas looked away without speaking. Moments later, Abigail quietly entered through the rear doors, revolver drawn. I heard every word. Holloway slowly turned toward her without showing the slightest fear. My dear Abigail, he said gently, put the gun down. You killed my brother. He threatened everything we built. You framed Luke. He was convenient. Outside, federal deputies silently surrounded the courthouse while Briggs watched through a side window. Inside, Holloway sighed. You should have accepted the lie. He suddenly reached beneath his coat and fired. The bullet struck Luke in the shoulder, spinning him backward. Before Holloway could fire again, Abigail shot the revolver from his hand. Thomas grabbed for another pistol, but Luke tackled him across the courtroom floor. Despite his injury, the two men crashed into the jury box while Holloway attempted to flee through the judge's chambers. Briggs burst through the rear entrance with federal deputies just as Holloway reached the hallway. Judge Benjamin Holloway, Briggs shouted. Federal warrant. Holloway fired one desperate shot before several deputies tackled him to the floor. Thomas surrendered moments later after realizing every exit had been blocked. Outside, Victor Graves attempted to escape town, but was intercepted by United States Marshals waiting beyond the bridge. Within hours, dozens of arrests spread across 3 counties as names from Daniel's ledgers led investigators to corrupt sheriffs, bankers, ranch owners, and politicians who had secretly supported the criminal empire for years. Several weeks later, the truth appeared in newspapers throughout the country. Luke Carter was officially declared innocent of Daniel Blackstone's murder. The charges against him were erased, and the governor publicly recognized his courage in helping expose one of the largest organized cattle theft conspiracies in Texas history. Daniel Blackstone was honored as the man whose investigation had finally brought the criminals to justice. His grave overlooking Blackstone Ranch became a place where ranchers stopped to pay their respects before beginning long cattle drives. Spring returned to the valley, covering the hills with fresh green grass. Blackstone Ranch slowly came back to life. Burned barns were rebuilt. Stolen cattle were returned to their rightful owners, and for the first time in years, laughter could once again be heard around the ranch house. One evening, Luke stood beside the same fence where Abigail had first found him after learning the truth. The sunset painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Abigail walked toward him, carrying Daniel's repair journal. "I've read every page," she said quietly. Luke smiled. He never stopped believing people could choose what's right. She handed him the journal. "I spent 5 years blaming the wrong man. You didn't know the truth." "I do now." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Abigail reached for his hand. "My father once told me not to let hatred decide my future." Luke gently squeezed her fingers. "What will decide it?" She smiled through happy tears. "You." Months later, beneath the wide Texas sky and surrounded by friends, cowboys, and neighboring ranch families, Luke Carter and Abigail Blackstone were married beside the old oak tree overlooking Daniel's grave. Captain Briggs stood proudly beside Luke, while the United States Marshal who had helped bring down the conspiracy attended as an honored guest. After the ceremony, Abigail placed a single white rose on her brother's headstone. "We kept our promise," she whispered. The prairie wind carried her words across the endless fields Daniel had loved. Luke took her hand, and together they rode across Blackstone Ranch toward the setting sun, not as a fugitive and the woman who once hated him, but as husband and wife, ready to build a future on the land that had nearly destroyed them, proving that while lies can survive for years, the truth always finds its way home. I love all of you, my wonderful audience of Wild West Tales. Tell me how this story made you feel. Leave a comment below. Type 1 if you love this story. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic tales from the wild.